Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Catherine Robinson. While all of us are rightly preoccupied with the coronavirus outbreak, there are many issues that continue to need our attention. Tonight, we bring you a special conversation we've been promising you, a focus on the pressures facing young Australians, housing and employment, for example, which were already proving to be significant issues for this generation. Before the coronavirus outbreak, 1 in 4 young Australians said they were experiencing issues with their mental health. Several weeks ago, we travelled to Tasmania, a state that sadly has the highest rate of youth suicide of any state and some of the highest rates of youth unemployment. Tonight, we bring you that conversation. We take a look at what's really going on and what can be done to help this generation of young Australians.
I work 5 days a week between 2 jobs, so yeah, six shifts in a week. So it is hard.
Not having enough to pay your bills and to feed yourself.
I'd say a lot of stress associated with work, friendship groups, a lot of money.
I've had a couple of jobs over the last couple of years, full-time and casual as well, but I have unfortunately lost those due to mental health.
Pressure to get a job, pressure to get a house. There's a lot of stuff going on right now with the economy, makes that stuff difficult.
I've applied for so many jobs and I just haven't heard back and it's really stressful.
A lot of people I've talked to don't want to have kids and stuff now because there's no future there for them, and there's not really a whole lot of future there for us, I guess, depending how quickly things turn.
We're not getting the help and support that we really are looking for.
And with me on the panel in Hobart this evening are TAFE student Grace Morgan. Grace is a member of Origin Youth Research Council and the chair of the Housing with Dignity Reference Group at the Hobart City Council. Thank you for joining us tonight, Grace. Caleb Nichols-Mansell is a member of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's Indigenous Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Group. Caleb is also the Tasmanian representative for Tek Wabi Giz, an Aboriginal, Torres Strait and South Sea Islander group working with the National LGBTIQ Health Alliance. You've certainly packed a lot into a short period of time there, Caleb.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to talking to you tonight. 5th year law and arts student at the University of Tasmania, Sharifa Syed Rohan. And last year she was the president of the Tasmanian University Union. It's really good to meet you tonight.
Nice to meet you too.
Lara Giddings is also with us this evening. Lara is, of course, the former Tasmanian Labor Premier and Health Minister. At one point, she was the youngest woman to enter Australian Parliament. Lara is now the CEO of the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Medical Association. Looking forward to speaking with you tonight, Lara.
Thank you.
And Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, Patrick McGorry, joins us tonight. He's also the Executive Director of Origin and a founding director of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation, Headspace. Thanks for joining us tonight, Patrick. And you can, of course, join us tonight on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum and on Facebook. Thought I might start tonight to tell our viewers and explain a little bit about what brings you all here. It's great to have you all here. Grace, I'll begin with you. You're a third-year student studying a Diploma of Leadership and Management at TAFE, but it's been a fairly challenging path and road for you to get here. You were homeless at 16, but you weren't considered at risk by authorities, which I found quite interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about your path to where you are now?
Absolutely. So I would definitely say that in my adolescence, early adolescence, I wasn't considered in that kind of at-risk category of youth. It's certainly never a situation I thought I saw myself ending up in, to be homeless at 16. And from there I've kind of built myself into a pathway of advocating for youth issues and becoming a youth consultant for lived experience.
And we will get you to unpack a little bit of your story later on,
Absolutely.
but thank you for coming on and sharing your story today. Caleb, you've also experienced challenges dealing with your cultural identity, your sexual identity growing up. You were diagnosed with depression at quite a young age, 17 or 18 years old, I believe. How were you supported during that time?
I think I was lucky enough to have a great support network around me in the network that I developed through my advocacy work. So organisations like Working It Out, which is Tasmanian's leading LGBTIQ support service, was a really great service for me, and staff within that organisation were great mentors and kind of shaped the person that I am today. But also the opportunities that I've been afforded, such as participating in National Indigenous Youth Parliament at the age of 16. As Lara said earlier, we were talking about the impact of visiting Canberra and Parliament House at a young age and how that led Lara onto politics. And that kind of echoed with me myself in that when I went to Canberra, I know that my eyes were quite wide and I thought that politics was where I wanted to go as well, until I realised that my identity is quite political in itself. So I live in a political sphere. I don't think I necessarily want to work in a political sphere.
Okay. Patrick McGorry, you're intimately involved with the issues impacting our youth, whether it be housing, education, whatever those issues are that feed into mental health, with your role as head of the International Association for Youth Mental Health of Young People. What do you see as the contributing factors to the deteriorating mental health that we're seeing with our young?
Well, young people have always borne the burden of the onset of mental ill health. That goes back decades. It's always been the same. But the climate seems to be changing around young people, if I can put it that way. What we call mega trends, the changing forces around young people, whether it's climate change, whether it's insecurity for job prospects, housing prices, all sorts of forces are affecting them these days, which create a lot more insecurity and instability than perhaps 30, 40 years ago. So we have evidence that, especially in terms of anxiety and depression, those sort of indicators of distress in young people are really getting worse. We have really good data on that. But the basic forms of mental illness and mental ill health, which emerge in this transition to adulthood, it's always been the case that is the biggest risk period. And we've never really, until recently, built a system of care to respond to it in a holistic way.
Lara, you were the youngest ever female at one stage elected to government. You were seen as a voice for young people, but why do you think we're seeing now so many of our youth across the country saying they're not being heard?
Well, I suppose in some ways because they're not being heard. There are just so many other competing voices out there that it's very difficult. But also I think we have to be careful that when we talk about young people, they're not a homogenous group. There are so many different people who make up that. So even though I was the youngest woman elected to an Australian Parliament at that time, I represented an educated group of young people. I didn't go through that same sort of life path that Caleb and Grace went through, for instance. So in comparison, I had a very privileged upbringing. So was I reflective of youth in that regard? Probably not. But I was reflective of a voice for young people and also a voice for women at that time.
Do you think you came from a generation that had it easier than the generation now?
It's certainly very different, and I think you could spend the whole hour talking about the changes that have happened in the last 20 years that change the way modern society works and is putting a lot of stress on young people but also on families, on everyone in the community. And the immediacy of everything now through social media, through Twitter, Facebook, all of these things. We are constantly bombarded, all of us, with the latest news. We are understanding the stresses that people are suffering around the world. Talking of issues like climate change impact absolutely everyone and make some people feel hopeless, which adds to stress and anxiety. So it's different, but we also had stresses too in my time. I remember always being worried about the Cold War, for instance. There was a Gorbachev-Reagan years and was someone going to push the red button? So we lived with fear too as young people. But it's just now, it's so in your face everywhere you turn. And
you can't shut your door to it.
You can't, not at all.
Sharifa, you're a fifth-year arts law student. You're in stable housing, but you have personally experienced stress and anxiety in your time. What's your greatest stress now? Is it paying the bills? Is it finishing your degree? Is it getting a good job? Is it getting the right job?
Yeah, I think there's a number of challenges for people my age, and particularly at this point in time, I find that a stress of mine is about finding my purpose and exactly what path I'm going to pursue. And I think that's really interesting because as we look around Tasmania, we've got very mixed demographics in terms of who has access to tertiary education and further education for that matter. So I think that I sit in quite a privileged position having been able to undertake tertiary education. And so now I feel like there's an immense pressure that I've placed on myself in terms of what I'm actually going to use this skill set I've developed for. And I think that a number of young people are, in my position are also feeling very similar.
And get a job ultimately in the end, because education and employment are clearly some key issues for our youth. In fact, more than 1 in 10 young Australians are unemployed, double the national unemployment rate. What's more, many of those who have managed to find work say they can't get enough hours to support themselves, with around 17% underemployed. Gemma Richardson is one of them. Since leaving school at 15 to care for her chronically ill mother, she has struggled to find secure employment. The 23-year-old has recently found work, but she's only just scraping by.
I'm an aged care worker in the community. I'm a casual worker, so my hours vary. I could have 6 hours, 7 hours tomorrow, but come the morning I might only have 2, 3. I look forward to going to work every day, even though I might only have 2 or 3 hours, but still it's something. I had a hard time at high school, always got bullied, all that kind of sort of normal stuff a lot of teenagers go through. And my mum had diabetes since she was 10, and so along with that came a lot of other illnesses. She had rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, which caused her to be near enough wheelchair bound. Me, my dad and my mum decided, well, I should leave school and sort of care for her, and so I did that. In July she passed, which was a bit of a shock. I was on carer's allowance for my mum for a while, but I think I was only getting roughly $120 a fortnight. I worked like in my local fish and chip shop. I did pizza delivery once I turned 18. I worked in a cafe as well. I couldn't find anything for longer than 2-3 months at a time. I was on job seeker until I turned 21, and then I went on to New Start allowance. I think I was getting maybe $5.80 a fortnight, and so that split between 2 weeks. It doesn't go a long way. I had to rely on my dad for a lot. I would have to say, oh, can I borrow some money for my car, and then the next fortnight pay him back. I am thankful for the Transition to Work program. They've helped me get my education under control and find the course I'm studying now, which is my Cert 4 in Community Services. Over the last year I probably put 58 or so applications in for jobs. Hopefully come next week. I had 2 interviews to get this job, so it was a long process. Oh, you're doing well. I'm roughly on 900 to a grand a fortnight, which is hard to live off. I've had friends that look down on me because I was on Centrelink, you know, and I had one of my friends say, oh, that's our tax money you're spending, you know. And I was like, well, I don't choose to do this. That kind of comment really affected me. I just sort of scrape by with maybe an extra $50 in my pocket if I'm lucky, but that mainly goes into savings because there's so much I want to do. I've got to have something to put away, or else it's, you know, my future plans aren't going to be there. And I work hard and I don't take time off, and it's not all about money either. You know, at the end of the day, it's life.
Grace, we saw there in Gemma's story she left school early to care for her mum. Perhaps for some of our viewers who aren't aware of the Tasmanian education system, you finish in Year 10 with an option to do Years 11 and 12 and then on to further study. What was the school experience like for you?
Absolutely. I found that it definitely had its challenges. I think there wasn't enough importance placed on the option of going to vocational education. I think it was very much seen as the subpar choice. The ATAR I found was very highly pushed that university academic pathway is something that everyone wants us to seek out. Unfortunately, I don't think that is fitting for everyone, particularly in what we've seen in getting employment after education. I think a vocational pathway is more supportive to that, and that's eventually the pathway I've chosen. But through the pushing of the education through university, I definitely became disengaged over time.
And what helped you to become re-engaged?
Absolutely. So I ended up doing my Certificate 3 and 4 in business. It was very much a choice of, I don't want to jump straight into full-time work. At the moment, I'm not in the headspace to do that. So I went through vocational education to do those, and now I'm at a point where I can step up my education, and I've become engaged in my diploma.
Caleb, you dropped out of school in year 11, but by no means are you a dropout because you've packed so much in after all of that. What was your decision to leave school in year 11?
I think it was the lack of support that I received. So my high school years were quite difficult. In grade 7, I was outed, not by choice, but by someone who I considered a close friend. And that really damaged my relationship with the school in the sense that they didn't support me and I didn't feel safe at school. So I disengaged between the years of grade 7 and grade 9, re-engaged in grade 10 just so that I could get off to college because for me that was really important. Got to college and realised that the options at college and the space that I was in, a bit like Grace, wasn't conducive to the environment, and me spending time there wasn't effective. So I made the decision to take a break from education, given the experience that I had with it, and to go find myself. Sharifa said that one of her biggest stresses at the moment is finding her purpose, and I feel privileged in the sense that in those 5 years that I took away from study, I was able to find my purpose and I was able to find my sense of self.
What's your purpose? What did you find?
I think my purpose is to create change, and I think as cliche as that sounds, I'm in a real position to create change. Tasmania is a small space, it's a small island where we're well connected, and with the networks that I've developed over the years, I feel as though the impact that I can have on society it would be beneficial to Tasmania, and so that's why I'm returning to study now at the age of 24 and studying business so that I can kind of, I've identified gaps basically in education, and I'd like to fill those gaps so that people like me don't go through the same journey that I did.
Is one of those gaps financial? I mean, is it a choice for you to go to university as if you can afford it or not? Is that something facing your generation?
Personally, for me, I wouldn't say that finances were one of the things that I was concerned with. I think we're quite lucky in Australia that we've got a HEX program where we can defer debt. I know that the debt still sits there, but it's not as immediate or as, I don't know, stress-inducing, I suppose, if it's off in the background. Also, we don't have to repay it until we earn a certain amount. So I feel comfortable in that. I think personally for me, it was more around my cultural identity and my sexual identity and that not being understood within the classroom and the education system. It's also a Western framework. Education, as we know it within Tasmania and Australia, isn't how we were educated as first people back in the old days. So it's a learning curve for us, not only learning what they're teaching, but learning how to learn what they're teaching.
I guess one of the ideas that Sharifa brought up before was about finding your purpose, and I imagine what one of those might be is finding a job that fits you and hopefully fits to what you've studied as well in the past. So exactly where are the jobs of the future going to be? Well, each year the federal government crunches the numbers and delivers an employment projections report for the next 5 years, giving us an idea of where the labour market is headed. 90% of jobs set to be created between 2019 and 2024 in Australia will require some kind of post-school qualification. For those who choose a vocational route, such as TAFE, the healthcare and social assistance industry will have plenty of jobs waiting. The sector is set to balloon by nearly 15% or 250,000 jobs. Many of those in aged care, childcare and disability care. Construction is a safe bet too, with more than 100,000 new jobs on the way. A couple of industries, though, are set to shrink. The long-term decline in some manufacturing sectors will continue. And the agriculture, forestry and fishing industries are stagnating thanks to extreme weather events and extended drought conditions across much of Australia. The healthcare sector is hungry for university-educated workers. There's a shortage of nurses. It's going to continue. More than 30,000 new nursing jobs slated for creation. More than 10% of the employment growth to 2024 is jobs for people with a uni degree. Though not every course has a job waiting on the other side. In 2018, for instance, only about half of creative arts grads and 60% of communications grads found full-time employment within 4 months. So Sharifa, listening to that story, do you think the education that this generation is receiving is preparing them for the jobs of the future? Are you studying the skills that you're going to need for when you're in full-time employment?
I think there's a really interesting point that was picked up in that video, and it's that the market is going to be demanding people take up professions that are very different to what they've been trained in their 20s or in their early adolescence. And so I think that at the moment the Australian curriculum perhaps doesn't teach us the skills that we need to be able to adapt to new environments and to new career paths. I know I'm very fortunate to be studying arts law, which is quite a broad skill set, which allows me to transfer communication skills into different fields, but there are other areas that people undertake that are quite narrow in their purpose. And so I think that in coming years, those people really struggle to be able to adapt to new environments. And so I think that we really need to start planning for that future and ensuring that people are equipped with the skill sets so they can make a difference, but also so that they can earn a living and also contribute to society.
I think going to your point there is studying the skill sets that they need for the future jobs that we don't perhaps even know exist at this stage is a conundrum for planners and curriculum writers. We hear a lot from politicians saying we've got to get back to basics, back to basics. Do you agree with that message?
I think that we need to make the education that's on offer more holistic, and that it gives people the opportunity to learn about skills and areas that are beyond the conventional areas that we study at this point in time. So I don't necessarily think it's about getting back to the basics, but it's about upskilling people so they're able to adapt to new environments and to create more resilient people so that we can go into environments and really take on the tasks and be self-sufficient and productive.
And this is all assuming that people stay in the education system. Pat, we know that the main reason young people drop out of education is mental health reasons.
Absolutely.
Do you think the government should be doing more to keep our youth in education, and what are the benefits of doing that?
Well, one of the biggest threats, as you say, to completion of education is poor mental health. It's the main health problem of young people going through high school, and it's great that Caleb and Grace managed to overcome that and actually keep their path and keep that scaffolding going, which is absolutely essential. Education and employment are the scaffolding which allow you to sort of flourish. But the biggest threat to that is untreated, unrecognised poor mental health in a holistic sort of way. And there's very little help for those young people in those school environments. There's a program run by Beyond Blue with Headspace, which educates teachers and supports teachers. But what teachers really need, I think, is hands-on support in their school environment, and then connection to places like Headspace and youth-friendly expertise to help young people negotiate that path. And that's starting to be built, but it's very slow. We need much more attention to that, and young people can help us design and make those things happen.
And these sorts of programs all cost money, as we know. Lara Giddings, do you think that the government has a full appreciation of how mental health affects students and these dropout rates? And is there an appetite at both a state or territorial and federal level to arrest the decline?
There is a necessity that we do arrest that decline, that's for sure. And I think governments are very aware of the complexities of all of these issues, of which mental health is one of them, and there's certainly more services that need to be provided aimed at young people. And mental health as a whole is underfunded and always has been underfunded. So there's resources that are required there. But it's also about governments understanding the need for some flexibility too for young people, that not all young people will flourish within the traditional school environment, but they need to be catered for and looked after. But on the other hand, there's a large group who will flourish within that environment. And I think that what our education system has to do is ensure that there is an element of the basics. We can't get away from reading, writing, arithmetic. We do need those basic skills. And in my mind, we also do need to keep subjects like history there, because if we don't learn about the past, how do we really understand the future? And that was one of the strongest messages I got from a history teacher was, Lara, there's nothing new in the world. So, and really she was talking about concepts and values and experiences, decisions that are made, that we keep repeating mistakes. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we also need to have an education system that sets our children up for future jobs that will be in the service industries, that will be in the creative industries, that will involve information technology skills, that will involve driving drones, that will involve participating in a world that we can't even dream of now.
But we know it's not just setting up for the future. If we look at the current employment and indeed unemployment rates, as we mentioned earlier in the program, current youth unemployment rate for 15 to 24-year-olds in 2019, 14%. And that hasn't changed since 2012. So that's pretty shocking.
It was when I was elected to Parliament.
Yeah,
it hasn't changed for 20, 30 years.
So why do you think you weren't able to affect change while you were in a position to do so?
Because I think these issues are so complex, and you're also talking about young people in a transition phase of their lives. So they're coming through the education system. They're determining whether they are going to break into the workforce at 18 years of age, whether they're going to do TAFE or university. They get lost sometimes in that process as well.
But could they be prioritised more by government with funding?
Well, yes, and I think there are certainly things government can do, such as invest in apprenticeships a lot more as well, that can help business create jobs for young people. But it's also about saying to young people, what do they need in that period of time as well? I'm actually an advocate for people taking some time out of education between high school and university, for instance.
That gap year
That gap
idea
year can be very beneficial.
Did either of you three take a gap year?
I took a 5-year gap year.
Right, but not a traditional. You went and worked and you found your purpose. And I know gap years are generally 1 year overseas working, but yours was a little bit different, would you say?
I wouldn't say that I worked for the 5 years, so I've done a lot of volunteer work, and that's where I've kind of got myself involved with the different organisations. But in that 5 years, I was able to kind of shape who I am and realise who I was and what my passions were, to make sure that when I did return to education and apply myself, I was applying myself to something that was valuable to me on a personal level.
Sharifa, there's no Minister for Youth here in Tasmania. There's a federal Minister for Youth, but that role is also shared, his portfolio, Richard Colbeck, is also shared with Minister for Ageing. Would you prefer to see that portfolio split and have someone from your generation represent as a Minister for Youth?
Absolutely. I think there's a strong need for a Minister for Youth, and I find it deplorable that there isn't, to be completely frank with you, because when we look around Tasmania, we look around Australia more broadly, there's so many issues facing young people, and there needs to be a strategy which is able to deal with those issues.
Grace, would you like to see that, having someone younger in that role? Or who's not to say that age, means anything? Is that an ageist comment?
Absolutely. I think we do need someone younger in that role. I think there's a great level of importance of helping our youth move from smaller initial roles, which are often particularly in media, and then moving them into actual roles based on their experience. And that's something I've kind of been trying to advocate a lot more recently, is providing those roles to young people who have lived experience.
And just finally, Pat, how do you bring these sorts of issues to be centre of the government? I know you're in dialogue with many government officials. How do you make it front and centre, even when you show them statistics such as the percentage of 15 to 24-year-old school leavers fully engaging in education, training and employment is 48.1% in 2019 compared to 74.6 in 2015. How do you make them see that this needs to be addressed when you've got this declining percentage of engagement?
Well, I guess the principle that I've followed, and it's sort of worked up to a point, I think, is that there's no point in going to government by just complaining about the problem. I mean, the actual data is incredibly powerful in mental health, and especially in youth mental health. The neglect, an English psychiatrist once said, the neglect of youth mental health is a form of self-harm that the society inflicts on itself, and that's so true, in every single way. But people know that. Politicians know this. What they want is solutions. So we've tried to go to government, federal and state, with solutions. And politicians respond to that, I found. If you can give them something that might work, and that's where Headspace came from, and co-designed with young people, we could not develop the right system without young people having a really strong influence and voice in that, coming back to the point about the youth minister. And that sort of works, and it works at every level. It works at the community level because the community want to look after their young people. They care about it, they're worried about it. Parents and young people are worried about these issues. The local MPs get behind it because they know that it's something they can, it can be a bit of a success story locally. They can be seen to be doing something for the community, which they want to do. And even Prime Ministers engage in it very, very heavily when you get these positive solutions. So, but we have to go further. There's a lot. We've built a base camp here, but we have not climbed the mountain, as Lara was saying. And if we build that mountain, as the Productivity Commission is now showing, we will save heaps of money and we will have much more productive lives and a stronger society. So we've got a huge opportunity, but whether there's the momentum for that, that's a question for the public and for politicians.
And there's competing factors always with issues such as that.
At the moment.
Well, you are watching The Drum, and tonight here in Hobart we're discussing the pressures and issues facing young Australians. With me on the panel are TASTAFE student Grace Morgan, member of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's Indigenous Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Group Clearinghouse, Caleb Nichols-Mansell, law and arts student at the University of Tasmania, Sharifa Syed Rowan, former Tasmanian Labor Premier Lara Giddings, and founding director of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation Headspace, Patrick McGorry. Well, here in Hobart, affordable housing is a major issue. It is the least affordable metropolitan area to rent in the country, and this is particularly biting for young people.
It's pretty basic right in a country like Australia to have a place to live and a place to call your own, and yeah, people are just being stretched way too far to achieve that.
I always see these articles that's like how to save more so that you can like cut down on your groceries to save for a house, but there are weeks where I spend like $15 on my groceries, so I can't really cut back on that more.
It scares me a little bit to think like I do want to be independent one day and all that, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that straight away.
I've gone into housing and applied for a house, but I haven't heard anything about one yet.
I wouldn't be surprised if I was renting for the rest of my life.
Pat, just how critical is stable housing for a young person's mental health? When does couch surfing stop being fun?
Well, I mean, you've just got to go back to the hierarchy of needs. You know, shelter, food, you know, sleep, basic things. You can't be mentally healthy unless that stability, that security is there. Safety and security, they're incredibly important for mental health. And yet, poor mental health is a risk factor for becoming homeless and a whole range of other problems. It's quite circular, isn't it? It's very circular, yeah.
Grace, we know that you were couch surfing when you were 16, 17 for a period of time. You've been a student, or before we move into you being in student housing now, what was that time like for you?
Absolutely. It had its own challenges. It was greatly difficult. I think the impact on my mental health was that I didn't recover mentally for a very long time. I was very much in fight or flight for my period of homelessness. But after that ceased, it was very much the after effects of that, and being able to get back to that place where knowing that I'm physically safe and that I have stable accommodation now. And just feeling secure in my own again took a long time.
So that's interesting. You went into a phase of survival mode almost while you were trying to find shelter. Absolutely. And the impact of that only hit you later. And how great was that impact for your mental health?
Yeah, it was very challenging. I think one of the biggest impacts that I could see coming out of that was that I became disengaged in my education because my mental health, that's very much a round conversation, but my mental health declined. I wasn't being able to receive the care for that. Yeah.
So you've been in student housing for around 4 years and you're ready to make the jump out of student housing into private housing, but that chasm is almost too big for you to do that. Is that right?
Absolutely. So I'm in supported accommodation, not supported accommodation, sorry, subsidised accommodation, I should say, through community housing. And I think there's definitely far too much of a gap between that and the private rental market. You know, we're looking at costs that are 2 and 3 times as great. We're not getting that support in the private housing. And there's not a sense of security there, especially after a period of homelessness, and especially when you're mentally vulnerable. You can't go necessarily into share housing because that's not a safe environment. It's critical that we provide those safe environments for young people, especially entering their first rental agreement.
Caleb, you are in private housing. How are you making that work, and how did you get to being in a place where you could make it work for you?
I think I'm quite privileged in the sense that my employment affords me the luxury of not really having to struggle to pay rent. However, I've got friends and family that are quite affected by the rental crisis here in Tasmania, and in particular one friend who, after they pay rent each fortnight, is only left with around $70 to live off for the rest of the fortnight. And that's only just covering rent. That doesn't include power, internet, food, fuel, all of those sorts of things. So I think it's quite frightening to look at that and see those effects and how it plays out on people. As Pat said, it's really important that we have strong mental health if we want to be successful in our education. And by supporting young people in getting into housing and secure housing, I think that would increase the number of youth going through the education system successfully.
It also brings up the notion of whether or not your generation indeed wants to follow the great Australian dream and own a house. So why is it for that generation, that dream of owning your own home is starting to look like, well, a bit of a nightmare? And what is it that is going to mean for the future of the country? Reporter Ellie Duncan explains.
Growing up, it just seemed like the thing that you did. Go to school, get a job, get a house. But now fewer of us, regardless of age, own homes, and more are renting. But if you go by recent surveys like this one from Triple J's Hack, it's still a thing that 1 in 2 young people want to do. So what's making it so hard?
Housing's certainly become much more expensive over the last decade.
Brendan Coates is the Program Director for Household Finances at the Grattan Institute.
So house prices have risen most strongly in Melbourne and Sydney. That's where prices have really exploded over the course of the last decade.
The median house price for Sydney sits at around $970,000. In Melbourne, it's around $778,000. In Hobart, it's around $500,000. The national average median house price, $552,000. Meanwhile, the median income sits at around $48,000 a year.
Prices have also been growing in a lot of regional areas as well, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales.
Brendan Coates says there are 2 key influences for growing house prices. The first, demand. The population is growing, but the supply can't keep up. And the other, more relaxed borrowing rules. People can borrow more now, and so they're spending more. And while prices are going up, it's getting harder for us to save.
To buy the average house when the average income, 20 years ago, you'd be spending about 5 years, to save up that 20% deposit. That's more like 8 to 10 years in our major cities today.
Rent and wages are going up, but not at the same rate. If you're on the lower end of the income scale, your rent is eating more and more into what you earn. Meaning if current trends continue, there'll be more and more people renting homes in the future.
The result of that is going to be a growing divide between the housing haves and have-nots.
That means for young people, housing stress won't just be a thing to contend with now, but for decades to come.
All the data that we have shows that if you're renting in retirement, you're in deep, deep trouble. You're at very high risk of financial stress and poverty, and therefore we really need to try to address this problem now before it becomes baked in to Australian society, and the great Australian dream of owning your own home is essentially lost for a generation.
Lara, listening to that report then, we heard from the economist saying you're in trouble if you're renting in retirement, but we have this generation where most of them, that is the future because the idea of owning their home is financially prohibitive. What can governments do? What did your government do to try and address this idea when you were in government, and what should they be doing now?
I think governments are still trying to help people keep that dream alive, that they can one day own their own home. And we had programs that still exist today called the Streets Ahead program, for instance, where people in public housing can actually buy their own home and have that home ownership as a very low income person. But I think the reality is we've got to start shifting our thinking, that you can have $100 million programs, $200 million programs like we do right now that will add in 600 odd houses, but you've got 3,000 people on a waiting list. It becomes a drop in the ocean. But financially, there's only so much governments can do, so we've got to look outside the square. And if you look to Europe, where there's a lot more renting, for instance, the protections for tenants are a lot stronger. In Australia, we tend to let landlords do and charge what they want. We've got to start looking at that side of the coin.
Patrick, what you were going to interject there?
Well, I just want to jump in and agree with Lara about what they do in Europe, where there's, for example, in Berlin, that's a very, very strong piece of policy that helps people actually have affordable rents. But I want to ask the question, why have governments stopped building public housing? It's all this talk about, it's really part of privatisation where you're selling off public housing and allowing people to buy it. What happened 20 or 30 years ago when the governments all around the world stopped building public housing? That's a really serious mistake in my opinion.
Sharifa, we might leave the last word to you on all of this. Do you still have a dream of owning your own home? And do you think that dream is attainable? And are there government programs in place, not just here in Tassie, but for people, you know, around the country to support that dream?
I think I would very much like to own a home, but again, in the reality of our current era, it's not easy for a young person to go into their house ownership area. But
if I can just ask, is there any stigma associated with saying I want to own my own home? Are you a lone voice?
I almost feel like there's some stigma as though when you have a house, you've made it. You're financially secure and therefore your future is almost confirmed. But I think that like what's been flagged before, if we were able to provide tighter regulation around the rental market to ensure that people are actually able to inject their own sort of personality into their home and use it as their own home as opposed to just borrowing it or renting it off a landlord for a period of time, I think that the dream of owning a home would almost become less relevant. And I think that at the moment it is both an economic desire, but it's also a desire for families to have a home to call their own. So I think what's been really impressive in Victoria is they've started to reform their laws around rentals and allowing people to pay into their properties if they so choose to, or to have pets in their property. So I think that really allows people to create a home.
To pop up artwork where you like, to change the lights, to have a pet. Okay, some great ideas there. Well, as we've been discussing tonight, mental health is a huge challenge for young Australians. The situation here in Tasmania is particularly dire. Hobart has the highest youth suicide rate of any capital city, and some are saying the obvious solutions are being ignored. Ted Mead's 16-year-old son, Liam, died by suicide in 2017. Just 2 days earlier, he left a Melbourne clinic where he was being treated for anxiety and depression. There was nowhere in Tasmania that he could go once seriously depressed. His father believes that if the state government had followed the recommendations of a coroner in 2015, his son would be alive today. 2 years after Ted Mead lost his son, his wife also took her own life. Julia Baird sat down with Ted Mead.
Ted Mead, thank you so much for joining us on The Drum.
Thanks.
Why do you think that your son's death was avoidable?
It's a simple process that there was just inadequate adolescent mental health care in the state, and had there been adequate mental health care, he would have been well looked after. I mean, he was just an adolescent who was going through normal adolescent issues, mostly hormonal growth, which was somatic, but a lot of it was just basic issues that kids go through at that time of their lives. And unfortunately, it compounded for him, and there was nowhere for him to seek help.
So what had happened? You said he tried to find help here. What happened?
Well, we did go to psychologists, and then we went to psychiatrists. And we weren't getting any good advice to deal with him. And essentially, we looked for something a little bit more comprehensive, and that was some form of therapy sessions, because we felt he needed therapy every day, not just seeing a psychiatrist once a week.
So we had to go to Melbourne because there was nowhere here for him.
That's right. There's just nothing apart from Headspace, which is a 6-week waiting period in Tasmania. We had private insurance, And so that means that anyone under the years of 18, regardless of what the healthcare is required, cannot get a service in Tasmania, even if you've got private health insurance. So there was no public facilities apart from going to emergency services or acute care somewhere.
So it was 48 hours after his release before he took his life. Tell us what happened in that time.
The 24 to 48 period, 8-hour period after they've been released, is the high risk area. And we were not informed of that. So we just thought he was being normal and happy. In fact, he'd premeditated what he was going to do.
In order to get this inquiry, you needed to prove that there was an ongoing risk to the children of this community. That if something was not done, then lives of children would be lost.
Exactly. We had to prove there was ongoing risk, and we knew that we would lose more children, and that's been the case, unfortunately. I've had people contact me saying, I lost my son, and I know had those recommendations been implemented from the 2015 coronial inquest, we would have had the facilities available had the government acted, and therefore my son would most likely be alive today.
So you're worried that other families will suffer the same kind of grief that you have?
I know they are, and there's nowhere for them to get assistance. And I mean, any other parents that are going through this is out there on their own. They're getting no government assistance whatsoever.
That must be a significant cause of distress for you.
Well, I'm certainly angry with the government, but I mean, I hold them responsible because, I mean, for them it's another statistic, but for me it's, it's my son, my very beautiful boy that I lost, which shouldn't have been, the scenario that should not have occurred.
So are you hoping to get closure from this inquest, if there even is such a thing?
Well, there's partly closure with the grief, and I believe that once these adolescent mental health care facilities are up and running, I feel that my duty is done, because then I know that other families have something to look forward to and to work with, and until that's happened, I can't move on. No scenario will bring my child back, so I have to live with that, and I'm determined to make sure that this doesn't happen to other children.
Patrick, you know the tragic story of Liam Mead. You gave evidence at his coronial inquiry. How do you think the system failed Liam and his family?
The system, the state government system in every part of Australia has really crumbled and fallen apart over the last 20-odd years since deinstitutionalisation. The promise was that we would build strong community mental health services to compensate for the loss of the large number of psychiatric beds that used to exist in the country. Now that was an old model, it needed to be changed, but no state government fulfilled that promise. And Tasmania's been particularly a problem at the state government level, but also at the federal governments have not supported Tasmania properly either. It's the one state that does not have an early psychosis program. So that more specialised federal government intervention is missing here too, but certainly at the state government level it doesn't have any inpatient beds for young people, and there's sort of a current band-aid proposal on the books for an adjunct and an annex for young people in an adult unit, which is a very bad idea. So you need proper planning for these things, and beds are like a key pillar of the system, but they're not the most important part really. They're an essential part, but they can't work unless you've got strong specialised community mental health services for young people that link with headspaces. Now Tasmania does have headspace centres. They can be built on by state governments and strengthened in this deeper and more sustained way. The solution is very, very clear for what Australia needs to do in youth mental health. And Australia's got a very good reputation globally. We have a contract, Origin does, with the World Economic Forum to globalise a model of youth mental health care based on a strengthened headspace idea. So the blueprint is there for federal and state governments. Will they invest in it is the question.
So
will they invest?
If we're world leaders, why are our youth struggling to get the help? Is it because the funds aren't there to invest in what you're saying is needed?
Well, we're starting from a very low base. We had nothing for young people really 20 years ago. We built a base camp, but we've got to climb the rest of the mountain. And as the Productivity Commission has shown, if you invest in this area, there's massive return on investment for the country. It's not going to cost the country anything. It's going to benefit the country if we invest here.
Could Liam's death have been avoided if the recommendations of the coronial inquiry in 2015 by the Tasmanian coroner, Olivia McTaggart, could his death have been avoided if those recommendations were adopted, which is what Liam's father agrees is the case?
Well, the coroner asked me that question actually, and I believe every single suicide can be prevented. And there's a zero suicide target in many parts of the world because people do not have terminal illnesses. They have problems that will kill them in the short term if they're not properly looked after and supported and helped. So none of these people have to die. And definitely Liam did not have to die. He could have been saved. And the sort of things that were in that original coroner's report would have been the things, not just the beds, but the actual strong safety net of community services where people care about the patient, they're compassionate, but they've got expertise and they work with the family, they work with the young person, and those lives can be saved. We save lives like that every day, but we lose people every day because there are holes in that safety net.
Lara, we hear from Patrick there about what needs to happen and what needs to come from government. You were Health Minister in the years leading up to the McTaggart inquiry. You had announced that there was a need for a dedicated youth mental health facility. That was, and I think you said in 2009 that would happen within 1 year. It didn't happen. There still isn't one. Why weren't you able to fix that problem? Why weren't you able to effect more change while you were the person in power?
Oh, it's really difficult. They're complex reasons in the end. Some of them are financial, some of them are workplace related as well. Some of them are the models of care and having the right models of care in place. So part of what I did as Health Minister in the mental health space at that time was to actually review and reform the Mental Health Act. We had an old act that actually didn't look after people's basic human rights across the board with people suffering mental health illness. So one of the things we did was to shift our thinking towards the person who had the mental health illness and working with them. But the actual resources are very difficult and we can all sit back and shake our heads. We have had many health ministers promise to open up sufficient beds. I believe now we will have some dedicated mental health beds in the new hospital that's going to be opened, K Block as it's known here at the Royal Hobart Hospital, but that's still going to be within the paediatric unit. So the person I was speaking to about this very issue said really you need a separate mental health unit for adolescent people.
Is that time frame acceptable? I mean, and admittedly, ensuing Liberal governments still haven't been able to fix the problem either, but people are dying. Sorry, Pat?
Yeah, can I just jump in? Yeah. Because often the politicians get the flack and they do need to do a lot more, but the public need to step up here too. We have set up a thing called Australians for Mental Health, which is a social movement in Australia to empower politicians that want to do the right thing here. And it's part of a global movement called United for Global Mental Health. We want to mobilise the public in their own self-interest. Politicians respond to the public as well as lead. And the public has not actually insisted on this.
Right. Is that something you would have responded to as a health minister at the time? If there had been a public social movement, would that have helped create this standalone facility?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I always say members of parliament are reflective of their community's needs and wants, and there's an element of the squeaky wheel does get the oil at the time. I have to say this is an area that has had a reasonably squeaky wheel though. It's not an area that has been totally ignored. But it's not easy. It's not easy to always implement what you want to actually achieve. But
sorry to interrupt, we are running short on time. Patrick, can you explain why mental health is always the poor cousin? If you look at the NDIS, I believe that services 400,000 people. Mental health service needs to service 10 times that, but gets half the amount of money.
Well, that's right. I mean, the NDIS, I'm not knocking the NDIS, but it's a tenth the scale of the problem that mental illness is in Australia. 22 billion a year spent on 400,000 people, 9 billion spent in Australia on 4 million Australians with mental health. The inequity is stark. You know, it's extreme. It's not just a squeaky wheel issue. This is a massive public policy failure, and it's not just in Australia. It's in every country in the world. 2% of health budgets around the world are spent on mental health. 14 to 15% of the burden of disease. It's a global neglect. But Australia should be a leading country in the world, not a follower.
Caleb, do you feel as though that area has been neglected, particularly at a time like this where we are buffering coronavirus, we are buffering, a low wage growth, there are so many other external factors going on. If we can look at, particularly, you were speaking about your cultural identity before, your sexual identity, what are the pressures on Indigenous and LGBTIQ people? Are they being catered for? Do you think, are they more vulnerable in your generation?
Absolutely. I think research backs that as well. So research shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to commit suicide and have higher rates of poor mental health. I don't know why that is or what the solution is. It's inspiring to have people like Pat working in this space to kind of get there. But I think the contributing factors that, that impact on this sort of thing is a lack of recognition around our cultural identity, a lack of recognition about our history. As Lara said, it's really important that we keep revisiting history and learn from history. A lack of cultural identity and sovereignty around our cultural rights and the things that we practice and the things that we do. As I touched on earlier around education, education is a Western framework that it has been implemented and forced upon us, and we don't always fit in that square box. And I think constantly being made to fit into that square box is a pressure that we don't deal too well with. And once we start to recognise that these groups of people are uniquely different from majorities, I think we can then tailor the support to them to make sure that they're getting the support that they need.
We've been dealing with some really heavy and complex and important issues that are, as I said, just heavy. But Grace, what's there to look forward to with your generation? I mean, you seem to be one galvanised by certain issues where you all come together and you have a really loud voice, but it's not all doom and gloom, is it?
Absolutely. I think we have really high levels of community engagement, really high levels of young people wanting to be involved in social change. And I think that's a really positive thing. I think we're going to see a lot of good come out of that.
Sharifa, what are you excited about with the future? What does the future hold for you if you're looking at the whole spectrum from good to bad and ugly?
I think I would echo Grace's sentiments in that we are so, I guess, we're under pressure by a number of different factors beyond our control, and I think it's actually brought our generation together. We have that shared, interest in affecting change, because affecting change means that we're going to have a brighter future for not only our generations, but the generations to come.
We travelled to Tasmania for that important discussion before increased travel and social distancing measures came into place. Thank you for joining us for this special program examining the ongoing pressures facing young Australians. And of course, those difficulties are becoming even more challenging as we all grapple with the coronavirus outbreak. In recent weeks, our panellists, Grace Morgan and Sharifa Syed Rohan, have both lost work. Aged care worker Gemma Richardson has also seen her shifts cut dramatically. She's down to just one home visit per day and is currently looking for more work. If tonight's conversation has raised any issues for you, you can contact Headspace, Lifeline or Beyond Blue. Those contact details are on the screen. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.